Anne Boleyn became Queen of England. Less than 3 years later, she was dead. Her rise had changed England forever. Her fall would be just as dramatic. Anne was born into a noble English family in the early 16th century. Her exact birth date is uncertain, but she grew up in a world where a woman's future was usually decided by her family, her marriage, and the political interests of the men around her. Anne, however, spent part of her youth away from England. She lived for several years in the Netherlands and later at the French court, where she was exposed to a very different world. She learned French. She became familiar with court politics. She learned how powerful women could influence the people around them. And she developed something that would later make her both fascinating and dangerous. She knew how to attract attention. When Anne returned to England, she became a lady at the court of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the wife of King Henry VIII. At first, Anne was simply another young woman among the ladies of the royal household. Then, Henry noticed her. And Henry was not a king who was easily forgotten once he wanted something. He was already married. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been queen for more than 20 years. She had stayed loyal to Henry, though only one child, Mary, had reached adulthood. Henry had become increasingly desperate for a male heir. But his interest in Anne was not simply about producing another child. He wanted Anne herself. And Anne refused to become his mistress. That decision changed the course of English history. Henry had been accustomed to getting what he wanted. But Anne would not simply enter his bed and accept the position of a secret lover. If Henry wanted her, she wanted something far more dangerous: marriage. The king would have to make her his queen. At first, this may have seemed impossible. Henry was already married to Catherine. And Catherine was not merely some woman he could quietly dismiss. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. She had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before Arthur died. She had then married Henry himself. For years, Henry had lived as Catherine's husband and king. Now he wanted the marriage ended. He began arguing that his marriage to Catherine had never been lawful in the eyes of God because she had previously been married to his brother. But there was a problem. The Pope had already granted permission for Henry and Catherine to marry. Catherine refused to accept that her marriage was invalid, and she refused to step aside for Anne. The dispute slowly became a crisis that went far beyond Henry's private life. Henry wanted an annulment. The Pope would not simply give him one. Catherine appealed against the decision, and Henry became increasingly convinced that Rome was standing between him and the future he wanted. Anne watched all of this unfold. She had started as a young woman at court. Now she was at the center of one of the greatest political struggles in Europe. Henry gave Anne expensive gifts. He wrote letters to her. He pursued her relentlessly. But Anne continued to resist becoming his mistress. Eventually, Henry took a decision that would transform England. If Rome would not give him what he wanted, he would reduce Rome's authority over England. Henry broke with the Pope. The English Church was placed under the authority of the English crown. The king became the supreme head of the Church of England. And the woman who had refused to become his mistress was now moving closer to becoming his queen. In 1532, Henry and Anne secretly married, but the marriage still had to be recognized. In 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England. For a woman who had once been simply one of Catherine's ladies, the transformation was extraordinary. She had achieved what almost nobody could have imagined. She had become queen. But becoming queen did not mean she had won. It meant the real danger was beginning. Anne needed to give Henry the son he desperately wanted. If she succeeded, her position could become almost untouchable. If she failed, everything could collapse. Anne became pregnant. The court waited. Henry waited. And in September 1533, Anne gave birth. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed that the child was not the son he wanted, but Elizabeth was healthy. And nobody yet knew that this little girl would one day become one of the most famous monarchs in English history. For Anne, however, Elizabeth's birth created a difficult reality. She was queen. She had changed the English church. She had helped bring down Catherine. But she had still not given Henry the male heir he wanted, and Henry's attention was beginning to change. Anne could be intelligent, charming, and politically influential, but she could also be difficult. She had strong opinions. She sometimes challenged the king. She supported religious reformers and became involved in court politics. She was not the kind of queen who simply stood beside her husband and remained silent. That made her powerful. It also made her enemies. Anne had opponents everywhere. Some remained loyal to Catherine. Others believed Anne had gone too far. And there was one woman who was becoming particularly important, Jane Seymour. Jane was one of Anne's ladies. Unlike Anne, Jane did not seem interested in openly challenging Henry. She was quiet, modest, and apparently willing to give the king the one thing Anne had struggled to give him, a son. Henry's interest in Jane grew. Anne noticed, and the woman who had once been pursued by the king now found herself watching him pursue another woman. The balance of power was changing. Then tragedy struck. Anne became pregnant again. This time, everyone hoped the child would be the long-awaited prince. But in January 1536, Anne suffered a miscarriage. The child was reportedly male. For Henry, this was devastating. For Anne, it was politically dangerous. Her enemies could now point to her failure to produce a son. And Henry's marriage was beginning to look like the very thing Anne had once replaced. A relationship built on hope was becoming a relationship built on disappointment. Then Catherine of Aragon died. Anne should have been secure. Her greatest rival was gone. But Henry was already looking toward Jane Seymour. And now the king needed a reason to remove Anne. That reason soon appeared. In the spring of 1536, Anne was accused of adultery. The accusations were extraordinary. She was accused of having relationships with several men at court. Among those accused was her own brother, George Boleyn. Other men were also named. One of them was Mark Smeaton, a musician at court. The charges became even more serious because adultery with the queen could be treated as treason. Anne was arrested. The queen, who had once been the most powerful woman in England, was taken to the Tower of London. Her world had collapsed with astonishing speed. Only a few years earlier, Henry had broken with Rome for her. Now, he was preparing to destroy her. But were the accusations true? This is where Anne's story becomes difficult. There is no reliable evidence that she actually committed the adultery for which she was executed. The evidence against her was deeply questionable. Some confessions appear to have been extracted under pressure. The dates alleged for some of the affairs did not always fit the movements of the people involved, and the political situation gave Henry an obvious motive to remove Anne. Jane Seymour was waiting. Henry needed a way out of his marriage. Anne was dangerous because she knew too much, had powerful allies, and had already demonstrated that she could change the political direction of the kingdom. Her enemies moved quickly. Thomas Cromwell, once closely connected to Anne's rise, was now involved in the investigation against her. Anne's brother George was also arrested. The accusations became increasingly sensational. The queen was supposedly surrounded by lovers, but the more the story was examined, the more suspicious it became. Anne was eventually brought before a court. She was found guilty. George Boleyn was also condemned. Other men accused of sleeping with Anne were executed. Anne herself remained imprisoned in the Tower. The woman who had entered the royal court with ambition was now waiting for death. But even in those final days, Anne did not simply disappear into silence. She spoke. She prayed. She prepared herself for the end. And she knew exactly what had happened. Henry had once wanted her so badly that he had shattered England's relationship with Rome. Now, he wanted her gone. Her marriage was declared invalid. Her daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. The Queen's title was taken from her. Everything she had fought to gain was being erased. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken from the Tower to the scaffold. She was only in her early 30s. She had been queen for less than 3 years, and yet, in that short time, she had changed the history of England. At the scaffold, Anne spoke to the crowd gathered below. She did not accuse Henry. Witnesses recorded her final words. She asked God to save the king and called him a gentle and merciful prince. Then she faced the executioner. Her death was carried out by a swordsman brought from France. Anne was beheaded, and the woman who had once stood beside Henry VIII as queen was gone. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The king finally got what he had wanted: a son. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to Prince Edward. But Jane died shortly afterward. Henry had his son. Anne was dead. Catherine was dead. And the English throne now had a male heir. But history had not finished with Anne Boleyn. Her daughter Elizabeth survived. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate after Anne's fall. She had lost her mother when she was only a child. Yet decades later, that same girl would become Queen Elizabeth I. And under Elizabeth, England would enter one of the most famous periods of its history. Elizabeth never publicly forgot that she was Anne Boleyn's daughter. The woman Henry had destroyed had left behind something he could not destroy: her bloodline. Anne's execution was supposed to end her influence. Instead, her daughter inherited the throne, and Elizabeth would rule for more than 40 years. Anne Boleyn's story is therefore not simply the story of a woman who married a king. It is the story of a woman who entered the most dangerous political world in Europe and managed to reach its highest position. She refused to become Henry's mistress. She demanded marriage instead, and got it. Her relationship with Henry helped trigger the English Reformation. She gave birth to Elizabeth. And then, when she could no longer provide the son Henry wanted, the same king who had fought to make her queen turned against her. Anne lost her crown. She lost her marriage. She lost her life. But she did not disappear, because the daughter she left behind became one of England's greatest monarchs. And that is the strange irony of Anne Boleyn's life. Henry VIII believed he was destroying the woman who stood between him and his future. Instead, he helped build the very dynasty that made her impossible to erase. Henry spent a kingdom chasing a son. History gave the crown to the daughter he wrote off. And that meant Henry's most famous marriage did not end with Anne's death. In many ways, that was only the beginning.